Hey, y'all, I'm Bud Elliott, and this is my college football summer school series on Cover 3. I bring on the team experts from the 24/7 sports staff and ask them the questions I care about. No fluff. Which players will be toughest to replace? What position groups are sneakily better or worse than I realize? We get you the scoop on each team in 20 minutes or less. Let's go. Hey, guys, Bud Elliott here. Welcome back in for another edition of College Football Summer School on the Cover 3 podcast. Today, we're going to talk Missouri, and for that, I'm going to bring on Dave Matter, the foremost expert on Missouri from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Dave, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, where do we go for this? We go to Dave. 6-6 last year in the regular season for Missouri. By the power ratings, the best team that Eli Drinkwitz has had in his couple seasons there. Obviously, we'll hear later in the show what Missouri fans are thinking about that. Did you see noticeable improvement from this team, even though the record wasn't necessarily better?
Well, on the defensive side, they were much better, and they were the most improved defense in the SEC. And part of that is because they were so bad in 2021, but that did make them, I think, much more competitive in most of their games. I mean, heck, they gave Georgia a better fight than just about everybody else in the country last year. But the common theme was it just wasn't enough. They had 4 games last year that were 4 losses, I should say, that were decided by a touchdown or less. So I think they've got some more talent. They've got some more depth than they've had, the last few years, but just haven't been able to finish. And there were still some weaknesses out there on the field, but I thought the defense at least gave them a chance to be competitive most weeks. They had a couple blowouts. They got beat bad at Kansas State. They got run off the field at Tennessee. But for the most part, they hung in there against most teams and able to get some nice wins against South Carolina and Arkansas. But it's just been kind of more of the same of just good enough to make a bowl game and qualify, but not really good enough to, get a lot of traction and like attract attention like the good Gary Pinkel years where you're now competing in your division. You're playing in better bowl games. They just haven't hit that point yet.
So the offense, really a massive drop-off from where they were in 2021. You mentioned that needing one more play. That was usually, to my eyes at least, needing one more offensive play. They could hit a big pass play occasionally. Nothing else really looked consistent. And I got to think part of that, just from watching these guys, I thought, okay, quarterback play, not great. I look back at Brady Cook's numbers. They weren't really that terrible. Are my eyes lying to me?
No, I think you're onto something there. I mean, he wasn't great. He wasn't an all SEC candidate. I also don't think he was at the bottom of the SEC in terms of production. He was better. He had a better year than some other guys. He was a really good running threat. He was the most rushing yards a Missouri quarterbacks had since they joined the SEC. So he was a threat there. I'm not sure you can pin losses on him necessarily. Now, if he plays a little bit better, if he gets better protection, then they've got a chance in some of those games where they lost by a touchdown or less. He was okay. I think they can get better play at that position. There's no doubt. Just more efficiency, more production. He was playing. We found out after the season that he was playing with the injured throwing shoulder that he hurt in week 2 at Kansas State. Now, it wasn't bad enough to where he couldn't play, and they didn't think he could get it any worse. But he did need surgery in January. So, maybe if he's healthy all year long, 100% healthy, he gives them a better shot in some of those closer games. But they had weaknesses elsewhere too. Their offensive line was not very good, despite having an all SEC left tackle. They didn't have much else, and the running game kind of suffered because of that. It wasn't very explosive. And outside of Dominic Lovett, and then occasional burst from Luther Burden, they didn't have a whole lot in the passing game either.
You mentioned Cook with the surgery. Is it right or correct to presume he's going to be the starter in the fall? That they did go get Garcia from the transfer portal from University of Miami.
There's still going to be a competition. Now, okay. What Eli Drinkwitz has said here lately and on some of the speaking engagements he's had around the state, is he describes Brady Cook as the incumbent, but he has to win the job still. He's not the starter necessarily per se. They brought in Jake Garcia, like you mentioned. They still have Sam Horn, which they really like Sam's upside and ability. They feel like, in the spring, Cook couldn't really compete for the job because he wasn't throwing yet. Garcia was there. Horn was playing some baseball and then had a little setback with his arm. So they didn't get a chance to see all 3 of those guys compete at full strength. I think they want to be able to see that first before they make any kind of decision.
You mentioned the loss of Dominic Lovett. I'm kind of a big believer in when teams go after a lot of players in one position, maybe they don't feel great about that position. I'm also a believer in teams that don't use the transfer portal or use it very sparingly, when they go get a guy, that guy's probably really good, which I think Lovett was good. Also, everybody in the slot position for Eli Drinkwitz seems to catch a million balls. So, how big of a loss is that? And I saw they're going to slide Burden back to the slot. So, I guess who's the replacement for Lovett on the outside, or I guess the replacement for the guy they had to move to replace Lovett?
Right. So yeah, Lovett was really good in the slot last year. It's crazy. He didn't play a lot of snaps. Like he was like not in the top 3 of receiver snaps for Missouri, but he was by far their leader, most productive guy. And so, like you said, I think that speaks to Eli Drinkwitz's offense and how it's geared toward that slot position. But he was really good, and he deserves all the credit. We'll see what he does at Georgia. So they're going to move Burden into the slot where they feel like he can be more of a mismatch. Get him in space more often, whether it's zone or man coverage against kind of a lesser defender than you would face on the outside. And then they brought in Theo Weiss from Oklahoma, who was, he was a starter at Oklahoma. He was never an all Big 12 receiver, but productive. I think he caught over, 60 passes there. It was injured in and out of the lineup. He was over 1,000 yards for his career there. I think they see him as an outside guy that can help for sure and take the place of Burden, essentially take the place of, Tosky Dove was there last year, was an okay receiver. So they, I don't know if they've got anybody outside of Luther that you can say, okay, this guy can be an all SEC receiver, but they've got some pieces. They really like, some of the younger guys that got a little bit of playing time last year. Mekhi Miller. They brought in Josh Manning, a highly touted guy. They have another transfer from Ole Miss, that didn't get a lot of playing time. There was kind of squeezed out of the rotation. So we'll see. But I think Burden's the big piece. If he can live up to fulfill some of the potential, some of the promise, and have played in a more natural position in the slot, then maybe they aren't as concerned about losing a Dominic Lovett.
So they bring in Marcellus Johnson from Eastern Michigan, was one of the more sought after tackles in the portal, and it's always hard to get even a decent tackle in the portal. Is this a group that you think, despite the loss of an all SEC tackle, that can take a step forward?
Well, we'll see. Now, Foster did stay. Javon Foster, their left tackle.
Oh, he's back. Excuse me.
Yeah, he's back. And then you add Marcellus Johnson on the right side. The big addition was they got Cameron Johnson from Houston.
Oh, they got the Houston kid. Oh, nice.
And the thing is, they need a center, and he's only played guard. He was an all-conference guard at Houston, but the plan is to give him a shot to win the center job because that is a big area of concern. They had Connor Tollison there last year. They really liked Connor and his upside, but he was a redshirt freshman and just didn't have a great year there. So that group has to be better. No doubt. They gave up the most tackles for loss of any offense in the Power 5 last year. They had a ton of penalties. They didn't look very well coached. And the interesting development was Marcus Johnson, their O-line coach, he left to go to Purdue, but he left after spring practices. So, they are catching up now. They hired Houston's offensive line coach, and then they go get Houston's all-conference guard. But it's not ideal timing. They bring in a position coach essentially in April. But again, I think that group has a lot of room for improvement. So maybe making a coaching change there can be the difference.
For sure. Now, with that offense sputtering last year, the defense was the best Missouri defense that we've seen in a couple of years. I got to admire the run of defensive coordinators that they have had there at Missouri, from Ryan Walters to Blake Baker. Top 25, you adjust for opponent. Our friend Bill Connolly has them squarely, I think, in the top 20. Only really one bad game, which was Tennessee, and that seems to happen to a lot of people who play Tennessee. I guess my other note here is they did play a good number of sketchy offenses / quarterback situations down the stretch in building that in fairness. Up front, I have some questions here. I mean, losing McGuire and Coleman to the draft / graduation, right? It is potentially kind of scary.
Yeah, that's the big unknown. Now they have some bodies there. They went out and got some transfers, but these are guys that have not been tested at this stage in this conference going against the lines that they'll have to go against. They're pretty good up front. I mean, Darius Robinson, I think, is an all SEC tackle. They bring back some other depth guys that can have played a lot of football at defensive tackle. But on the edge, there's just not a lot there that have established themselves. They like Johnny Walker Jr. He's a junior. He played some last year, not a lot. They brought in Joe Moore, a St. Louis kid from Arizona State, who had okay numbers at Arizona State. He was a starter there, but he wasn't an all Pac-12 guy or anything like that. They've got some other bodies that they've added here recently, so they're going to have to identify some playmakers on the edge. Because, like you mentioned, McGuire was an all SEC guy, no doubt, 4th-round NFL draft pick. DJ Coleman really came on strong in the second half of last season. So they've got to figure out that pass rush. I mean, the good news is they're set everywhere else on that defense. They brought everybody back, guys who had a chance to be, mid-round draft picks probably with NIL. They were able to bring some of those guys back and a whole bunch of them in the secondary and linebacker, including Robinson there. So that's a good situation outside of pass rusher on the edge.
If you're a surefire 7th-round type draft pick, it can make a lot of sense to come back for an extra year, try to improve your draft stock, and make high 5, low 6 figures in NIL, but in addition to all the other stuff that you get. What do you make of Trajan Jeffcoat going to Arkansas? I just thought that was weird. Like it seems just kind of a lateral at best move.
Well, his situation was kind of unique. He was going to come back to Missouri. He lost his starting job last year to Coleman and didn't have a very good year. He decided to come back and then changed his mind again, and ends up at Arkansas. Now he missed a year at Missouri. He was removed from the university. It's a discipline case, and I think that is still essentially on his record. It was never, I've heard a lot of things kind of secondhand on what it was. He was pretty much cleared of it, but it's still on his record. So I think that might have impacted his recruitment a little bit. And, I think Missouri would have been fine if he came back, but I don't think, it wasn't the end of the world that he didn't, because he just didn't play all that well last year. He was better 2 years ago, and his play just kind of slipped off. So, Arkansas is a place he's probably familiar with to some degree. I mean, Barry Odom, before he left, was his was his head coach when he first got to Missouri. But then Odom goes to UNLV, so at least he was, he had some connections down there, and was familiar with the program.
That makes sense. You mentioned basically the entire back 7 returns. Stylistically, is it correct to assume that they're probably going to be able or want to blitz more, or perhaps have to blitz more this year? And has Blaker discussed that at all?
Yeah, they might, just because of, a little bit of the unknowns at defensive end. And they did blitz a lot, at times last year too. And it was kind of dependent on the matchup. But Tyrone Hopper is a really good pass rushing linebacker. And I think he led the SEC, or was top 3 in tackles for loss last year. And he's a guy that probably could have gone to the NFL draft and been a 4th-round draft pick or 3rd round, something like that maybe. But they've got him back, and just a really good first-year transfer from Florida that he had last season. And I think they've got the corners that can hold up in man coverage to allow you to send some extra pass rushers from linebacker spot or blitz at safety or things like that. And Ennis Rakestraw and Chris Abrams-Drain, those are veteran guys that have played a lot of SEC football. So it's a really good situation back there. I think collectively some of those guys that decided to come back, part of the decision to come back was they wanted to come back together and kind of build on what they did last year. So, there's never a guarantee. Just because you come back for a senior year doesn't mean you're going to play better than you did your junior year. But when all of them are kind of driven and wanting to do the same thing, and you don't really have weaknesses except maybe some of those unknowns at defensive end, you set yourself up to have a pretty good defense, I think.
We asked this question in all these summer school episodes. I figure I know where you're going with this, but where's the spot, the drop off between the starters and the backups, other than quarterback, although it may not be quarterback at Missouri right now, where the drop off is huge, and just, all right, they can't have the starters go down because the backups are just not SEC ready?
Yeah, that's a good question. Their corners, their backup corners haven't played a lot. Rakestraw and Abrams-Drain especially play a lot of snaps. At safety, they've got some young safeties they've brought in. I mean, Jalen Carlisle and Joseph Charleston played a ton of snaps last year as the 2 starters, and you've got Dalen Carnell coming in, likely be a starter. And I think they're okay there. They went out and got a couple Power 5 safeties to compete for starting jobs. So I think the depth is fine there. I'd look more on the offense. Receiver, got some guys, but they don't really have proven backups. There's still question marks there. And then especially that offensive line, like that is just a spot where, even last year, you're like, man, there's some starters that I'm not sure they should be necessarily starting in the SEC. What about the backup? So you got some young guys there, but they just haven't been in the program very long. And if you're an injury or 2 away from having to play a really untested young offensive linemen in the SEC. That can be tough.
Dave, really appreciate the time here on Summer School. Everybody make sure to follow Dave Matter, Dave_Matter, Missouri coverage for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And I think the best guy to follow if you want some Missouri coverage out there. Appreciate the time, man.
Yeah, really appreciate it.